What does it take for someone at the peak of fame to walk away from the idea that life is purely material? We live in an age obsessed with achievement, where wealth, influence, and freedom are treated as the ultimate goals. People work their entire lives for the success that celebrities seem to have in abundance. But here's a question few expect. Why are some of these very people, the ones who have it all, suddenly searching for something more? This isn't a fringe phenomenon. It's a cultural shift happening in real time. And nowhere is it more fascinating than in the story of Joe Rogan. Known for his blunt, no-nonsense worldview, Rogan once called religion scaffolding for idiots. He positioned himself as a hardened skeptic, a man who believed logic and reason had solved life's biggest questions. Yet in recent years, something has changed, dramatically. The same voice that mocked faith now speaks about spirituality with curiosity, even reverence. And here's the kicker. Rogan isn't alone. Across Hollywood and beyond, some of the most influential names, actors, musicians, comedians, are rediscovering faith in ways that challenge the assumptions of our secular age. From Shia LaBeouf, who credits Christianity for saving his life, to Russell Brand, who speaks openly about Jesus after decades of addiction and chaos, the pattern is undeniable. People who have everything the world can offer are realizing it's not enough. But what's driving this shift? Is it just a fad, a PR move, or something deeper? A hunger for meaning that money and fame can't satisfy? And what does Joe Rogan's journey tell us about the spiritual state of modern culture? In this video, we're going to explore how Joe Rogan went from mocking faith to wrestling with life's biggest questions. The pivotal conversations that cracked his certainty. The larger movement of public figures embracing spirituality in an age of skepticism. And finally, what this means for you and me living in a world where faith is often treated as outdated. By the end, you'll see that these stories aren't just about celebrities. They reveal something profound about all of us. Because when even the people who made it are searching for something more, maybe the real question is, what are they finding that we've missed? So grab your seat, because this isn't just a story about Joe Rogan. It's about the rediscovery of faith in the most unexpected corners of culture, and why it might matter more than ever before. To understand the significance of Joe Rogan's spiritual curiosity today, we need to rewind and see who he was not too long ago. A man who wore his skepticism like a badge of honor. Rogan wasn't just casually disinterested in religion. He was actively critical, even contemptuous. His position was clear. Religion was an outdated survival mechanism, a crutch for those afraid of reality. On multiple occasions, Rogan compared faith to scaffolding for idiots. In his mind, religion was a construct, a simplistic moral GPS created to keep weak-minded people in line. He once quipped that believers were essentially atheists about all other gods. "You're just an atheist in regard to Zeus or Thor," he said, framing faith as nothing more than cultural conditioning. These remarks weren't off the cuff. They were part of a worldview Rogan had thoroughly embraced. For Rogan, science and reason were the ultimate arbiters of truth. Anything that couldn't be observed, measured, or tested didn't deserve serious consideration. That perspective was deeply embedded in his public persona, especially on the Joe Rogan Experience. His podcast wasn't just a platform for conversation. It was an arena for challenging ideas, and religious belief rarely left unscathed. Guests who brought up faith often found themselves facing his trademark smirk and a line of questioning that could feel like intellectual sparring. But why does this matter? Because Rogan wasn't just another skeptic in the crowd. He was shaping cultural attitudes. His podcast reaches an estimated 11 million listeners per episode, a reach larger than most mainstream media outlets combined. When Rogan dismissed faith as nonsense, millions of people absorbed that perspective, consciously or not. His skepticism carried weight because it came from someone viewed as a truth seeker, an everyman unafraid to call out pretension. And let's be honest, Rogan's skepticism resonated with a generation raised on internet fact-checking and YouTube debates. Religion, for many in his audience, was already on shaky ground. When Rogan scoffed at faith, it confirmed what they suspected, that belief in God was for the uninformed, the uncritical. In a culture obsessed with evidence-based thinking, Rogan became an unlikely high priest of secular rationalism. But here's where it gets interesting. His arguments weren't new. They echoed the same lines popularized by figures like Richard Dawkins and Sam Harris during the peak of New Atheism. If God exists, Rogan mused in one conversation, why hasn't he shown himself? To him, divine silence was proof of divine absence. These weren't just passing thoughts. They were convictions he reiterated for years. And yet, beneath the bravado, something was brewing, a subtle tension that would later become impossible to ignore. Because as confident as Rogan sounded, life has a way of presenting questions that facts and logic can't fully answer. What happens when you face mortality? Why does love, beauty, and awe feel so transcendent? And why do so many people Rogan admired, thinkers, artists, athletes, speak about faith not as superstition, but as wisdom? At this stage, Rogan didn't have answers. He didn't even admit to asking those questions. But history tells us that transformation rarely begins with certainty. It begins with cracks. For Rogan, those cracks started appearing not through theological arguments, but through encounters, moments when his materialist framework collided with something he couldn't easily explain. And this is where the story gets fascinating. Because when Rogan's walls began to come down, it didn't happen in a church pew. It happened on his own turf, the podcast studio, through conversations that millions of people witnessed in real time. Conversations that introduced new ideas, surprising testimonies, and perspectives he never saw coming. Before we dive into those moments, let's pause for a second. Ask yourself, why does this matter to you? Because Joe Rogan represents more than one man's opinion. He reflects the mindset of millions of people who've dismissed faith as obsolete. Maybe even your friends, family members, or coworkers. If someone like Rogan can shift from mocking faith to exploring it with genuine curiosity, what does that tell us about the power of honest conversation and open-mindedness? And as you'll see in the next section, those conversations weren't just casual chats. They were turning points. They came from guests who brought something Rogan couldn't ignore. A combination of intellectual depth and personal experience that challenged his assumptions in ways no online debate ever could. So let's step into that studio, where some of Rogan's most unexpected encounters cracked the foundation of his skepticism and started a journey that would surprise not just him, but millions watching around the world. When you think about what could shake a man like Joe Rogan out of his certainty, you might picture a heated debate or some earth-shattering evidence. But the reality, it wasn't arguments, it was encounters. It happened gradually in long-form conversations on his own podcast, where Rogan's signature curiosity met something unexpected. The kind of faith that doesn't just preach, it thinks deeply and lives authentically. The first big crack appeared during an episode with Jordan Peterson. For years, Rogan saw the Bible as a relic, a collection of outdated stories. But Peterson approached it differently, not as superstition, but as a foundational truth structure for civilization itself. His words hit Rogan in a way that no Sunday sermon ever could. The Bible isn't just true, Peterson argued. It's the precondition for the manifestation of truth. It's what makes truth possible. That stopped Rogan in his tracks. This wasn't some abstract theological rambling. It was a reframing of reality itself. If the Bible is more than a book, if it's the bedrock of meaning, then dismissing it isn't just rejecting religion. It's rejecting the very roots of truth. Rogan leaned in, his usual skepticism replaced by genuine curiosity. What do you mean by that? That question, so simple yet so telling, marked a turning point. You could sense Rogan grappling with the possibility that faith isn't the enemy of reason, but its foundation. And then came another moment. Mel Gibson, the actor and filmmaker behind The Passion of the Christ, sitting across from Rogan. Their conversation started casually enough, but soon veered into theology. Gibson spoke about mercy, a concept that, for Rogan, seemed almost foreign in its depth. Gibson explained how God's love reaches beyond human failures, referencing the thief crucified beside Jesus, the man who received grace in his final moments. The lawmaker is above the law, Gibson said. That's why there's so much mercy. Rogan didn't dismiss it. He didn't laugh it off. Instead, he asked a question that felt deeply personal. What about people who've never even heard of Christianity? What happens to them? That's not the question of a mocker. That's the question of a seeker, a man wrestling with ideas too big to ignore. But the shift didn't stop there. Enter Matthew McConaughey, the Hollywood star whose easy charm masks a surprisingly profound faith. McConaughey didn't preach. He talked about practical spirituality, the kind you can live out day by day. He quoted scripture, not as dogma, but as wisdom for real life. Love your neighbor as yourself. That one, I know what to do with. Rogan didn't push back. In fact, he resonated with McConaughey's approach, even musing that spiritual discipline might be as vital as physical training. For a man who built his brand on optimization, health, fitness, mindset, that was no small admission. Here's why these moments matter. They reveal a pattern. Rogan wasn't swayed by clever arguments or fear of hellfire. What moved him were lived truths, stories and insights from people he respected. These weren't naive believers clinging to fairy tales. They were thinkers, achievers, people Rogan admired for their intelligence and authenticity. And this is where many skeptics find themselves today. Not confronted by evidence that proves God, but by lives that make faith plausible. It's easy to dismiss an idea. It's harder to dismiss a transformed life. But if you think Rogan's curiosity peaked there, think again. Because the next encounter took things from intellectual to personal, introducing something that would challenge his materialist worldview at its core, the possibility of the supernatural breaking into real life. That story? It came from a biblical scholar named Wesley Huff, whose testimony would leave Rogan stunned. Huff spoke about being paralyzed at 11 years old, told by doctors he'd likely never walk again, only to wake up a month later completely healed. The medical team had no explanation. They were the first to call it a miracle. Rogan's reaction wasn't disbelief, it was fascination. "That's crazy," he said, "because after just a few weeks in a cast, your muscles atrophy. So for you to just get up and walk." It wasn't proof in the scientific sense, but it was enough to make Rogan pause, enough to make him wonder if the world is bigger than what fits under a microscope. And here's the thing, these aren't isolated anecdotes. They form a mosaic, a pattern of curiosity breaking through skepticism. And this pattern isn't just Rogan's, it's everywhere, especially among cultural influencers who once championed a purely secular worldview. Which brings us to the bigger question. Is Joe Rogan's journey just a personal detour, or is it part of a much larger cultural shift? A shift where people at the top of the fame and fortune pyramid are discovering that success without meaning feels hollow? Stick around, because in the next section, we're zooming out to look at the bigger picture. Why actors, musicians, and cultural icons are rediscovering faith in an age that said God was dead. And why, if you pay attention, this might be the most surprising comeback story of our time. Joe Rogan's transformation might feel surprising, but it's not happening in a vacuum. Across Hollywood, sports, and entertainment, something unexpected is unfolding. A growing number of celebrities are talking openly about faith, sometimes even embracing Christianity, at a time when conventional wisdom says religion is outdated. Take Russell Brand, for example. For years, Brand was the poster child of hedonism, fame, drugs, sex, the whole rock star lifestyle. By his own admission, it nearly killed him. But today, Brand speaks with startling openness about Jesus, not as a metaphor, but as a living presence who changed his life. He's candid about his past chaos and equally candid about what saved him. Following Jesus, he says, is the most real thing I've ever done. Then there's Shia LaBeouf, whose story could be a Hollywood script. At the peak of his career, LaBeouf spiraled into self-destruction, legal troubles, addiction, public meltdowns. When he hit rock bottom, he didn't turn to another self-help program, he turned to God. Preparing for his role in Padre Pio, he encountered Catholicism not as a distant ritual, but as a lived reality. In interviews, he's clear, his conversion wasn't about image, it was about survival. "I didn't know how to live anymore," he admitted. "Jesus gave me away." Even action stars like Mark Wahlberg are going public about their faith, not in a preachy way, but with quiet consistency. Wahlberg wears ashes on Ash Wednesday during national TV interviews. He posts about prayer. He tells his fans, "Faith is everything. It's not popular in Hollywood, but it's real for me." What's striking about these stories isn't just the individual transformations, it's the pattern behind them. People who seem to have everything, fame, fortune, influence, discover a truth the rest of us often miss. Success can fill your bank account, but not your soul. Here's the uncomfortable reality. Our culture promised that if you climbed high enough, if you got the money, the likes, the recognition, you'd be happy. Yet some of the most celebrated names in the world are saying, "We tried it. It didn't work." And this isn't just a celebrity issue, it's a human issue. Rising rates of anxiety, depression, and loneliness tell us something is deeply broken. We live in a time of material abundance, but spiritual famine. The more connected we are online, the more disconnected we feel inside. The more options we have, the emptier life can seem. So why now? Why are so many turning back to faith? Psychologists call it the meaning gap. Technology gave us convenience. Science gave us answers, but neither gave us purpose. And purpose, real, durable purpose, comes from something bigger than ourselves. That's what faith offers. Not just rules or rituals, but a story that makes sense of suffering, love, and mortality. And here's where Joe Rogan fits in. He's not out there preaching sermons. He hasn't declared a conversion, but his questions, the ones he asked Mel Gibson or Jordan Peterson, are the same questions millions are asking silently. What's the point of all this? Why do I feel empty when I've made it? Is there more to life than what I can see and touch? Rogan's platform makes these questions public. And that matters because culture shifts don't start with institutions. They start with influencers. When someone like Rogan opens the door to spiritual conversations, he makes it okay for others to do the same. But here's the real hook. If the people who have it all are still searching, what does that say about the rest of us? If the wealthiest, most famous, most admired figures can't find lasting fulfillment and success, then maybe the problem isn't that they aim too high, but that they aim too low. And maybe that's why faith, once dismissed as outdated, is making a comeback. Not because people are running from reason, but because they're running toward meaning. Because deep down, we all know the truth. You can't live on achievements alone. You need hope. You need love. You need a story big enough to hold your life and your death. This is where the conversation gets personal. Because whether you're Joe Rogan, Russell Brand, or just someone scrolling through YouTube at 2 a.m., the question isn't, do you believe in God? The real question is, what are you trusting to make sense of your life? And that brings us to the final part of our journey, where science, psychedelics, and spirituality collide in Joe Rogan's search for ultimate meaning. It's where all becomes a doorway to God, and where the biggest surprise might be that faith doesn't begin with certainty, but with wonder. If there's one theme that runs through Joe Rogan's podcast, it's curiosity, the relentless drive to explore what lies beyond the obvious. And for Rogan, one of the most fascinating doors to that mystery has been psychedelics. For years, he's championed substances like DMT and psilocybin as tools to expand consciousness, challenge assumptions, and break free from the ordinary. For Rogan, psychedelics aren't just recreational, they're revelatory. He's spoken often about experiences where time dissolved, ego vanished, and the universe seemed to open like a cosmic flower. These moments shook him, leaving him with a sense of awe he couldn't shake. "I think it's spiritual," Rogan admitted in one conversation. "I really do. Looking out into the universe, there's something undeniable about that." That sentence is worth pausing over. Here's a man who once dismissed religion as childish superstition, now acknowledging a spiritual dimension to reality. Not because he read a theological argument, but because he experienced something that felt bigger than himself. This is a pattern we've seen before, not just in Rogan, but across culture. When the modern world stripped life of transcendence, people didn't stop craving it. They just looked for it elsewhere, in mindfulness, in yoga, in the neural fireworks of psychedelics. Why? Because the hunger for transcendence is built into us. We long for something beyond what science can dissect, something that gives life meaning, not just mechanism. Now, to be clear, Rogan hasn't claimed psychedelics prove God, but listen closely and you'll hear a shift. Where he once spoke of consciousness in purely material terms, he now flirts with the possibility that there's more. something his old worldview can't fully contain. He marvels at the mystery of existence, the beauty of the cosmos, the sheer improbability of life. That sense of awe, once a footnote in his thinking, has become a headline. And here's the irony. The very tools Rogan thought would dismantle religious ideas may be pushing him toward the questions faith has always asked. Why does anything exist at all? Why does beauty move us so deeply? Why do we yearn for meaning as much as for oxygen? Because at the end of the day, psychedelics can simulate transcendence, but they can't satisfy it. They can trigger visions, but they can't anchor hope. They can open doors, but they can't tell you what's on the other side. As one theologian put it, mystical experiences can lead you to the threshold of the divine, but they can't carry you across. And this might explain why Rogan's conversations about faith don't sound like a man chasing a high. They sound like a man searching for a home. Listen to him long enough and you'll hear it. A longing for something stable, something true, something bigger than himself. In one striking comment, Rogan mused, "I think as time rolls on, people are going to understand the need to have some sort of divine structure, some sort of belief in the sanctity of love and of truth. That's not just philosophical curiosity. That's a cultural pulse. A generation raised on self-help and Silicon Valley optimism is waking up to a reality Rogan now voices. You can't engineer meaning, you have to receive it." And here's where the story comes full circle. Rogan's fascination with psychedelics started as a quest for freedom, from dogma, from limits, from certainty. But what if freedom isn't the absence of structure, but the presence of truth? What if the highest form of consciousness isn't found in dissolving the self, but in anchoring it to something eternal? This isn't just Rogan's question, it's ours. Whether you've tried psychedelics or not, you've probably felt the hunger they hint at, the desire to feel alive, connected, awake to something bigger. Ooh, that's the same hunger behind every spiritual quest. And maybe, just maybe, that hunger isn't an evolutionary glitch. Maybe it's a homing signal, pulling us back to the one who made us. So here's the twist. The very thing Rogan thought would make faith obsolete, science, reason, altered states, may end up being what drives him to faith's doorstep. Because when you stare long enough into the mystery, you realize it's not an illusion, it's an invitation. And that brings us to the final chapter. What Joe Rogan's journey, along with countless others, tells us about the future of faith, the human search for meaning, and why the biggest surprise might be that the answer was there all along. Joe Rogan's story isn't finished, and maybe that's the point. It's not a neat conversion narrative with a bow on top. It's a journey, one that millions are watching unfold in real time. A man who once mocked faith as scaffolding for idiots now speaks about the need for divine structure, the sanctity of love and truth, and the possibility that life is more than atoms colliding in the dark. But here's the real question. Why does his story matter to us? Because Rogan isn't just a podcast host, he's a cultural barometer. His questions mirror the questions of a generation. Is there more to life than what we can measure? Why do success and freedom still leave us feeling empty? What if the answers aren't in more control, but in surrender? And the more Rogan explores these questions, the more we see a bigger pattern. From Russell Brand to Shia LaBeouf, from Matthew McConaughey to Mark Wahlberg, people at the top of the fame and fortune pyramid are rediscovering something ancient. Not because they've abandoned reason. Does that mean Joe Rogan will become a Christian? We don't know. And honestly, that's not the point. The point is this. When a man with Rogan's platform, influence, and skepticism begins to wonder out loud, it signals something bigger, a cultural longing for transcendence. A quiet rebellion against the flat, secular story that says we're nothing but biology. And here's what I want you to take away. Faith doesn't begin with certainty. It begins with wonder. Not with having all the answers, but with asking better questions. Questions like, what if love and truth aren't human inventions, but divine fingerprints? What if the hunger for meaning is a homing signal, pulling us back to the one who made us? So what do you think? Are Joe Rogan's questions just curiosity, or the first step towards something deeper? And what about you? In a world that offers endless distractions, but so little meaning, What story are you living by? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear your take. And if this conversation sparks something in you, hit that like button, share this video, and subscribe for more content exploring faith, culture, and the questions that matter most. Because here's the truth. You don't have to be Joe Rogan to ask big questions. You just have to be human. And sometimes the path to faith doesn't start in a church pew. It starts in the silence after the noise, in the wonder that won't let you go. Until next time, stay curious, stay open, and remember, God is on the move in ways you might never expect.